though with erratic clumsiness. Sanford called sharply, "Don't touch the hull without gloves. If it isn't nearly red hot from the sunlight, it'll be below zero from shadow." Joe realized then the temperature effects the skin on his face noticed. A part of the spaceship's hull gave off heat, like that of a panel heating installation. Another part imparted a chill. Sanford said unpleasantly, "You want to report your heroism, eh? Come along." He clanked to the doorway by which he had entered. Joe followed, and Mike after him. They went out of the lock. Sanford suddenly peeled off his metal-soled slippers, put them in his pocket, and dived casually into a 4-foot metal tube. He drifted smoothly away along the lighted bore, not touching the sidewalls. He moved in the manner of a dream, when one floats with infinite ease and precision in any direction one chooses. Joe and Mike did not share his talent. Joe launched himself after Sanford, and for perhaps 20 or 30 feet, the lighted aluminum sidewall of the tube sped past him. Then his shoulder rubbed, and he found himself skidding to an undignified stop, choking the bore. Mike thudded into him. "I haven't got the hang of this yet," said Joe apologetically. He untangled himself and went on. Mike followed him, his expression that of pure bliss. He was a tiny man, was Mike, but he had the longings and the ambitions of a half a dozen ordinary-sized men in his small body. And he had known frustration. He could prove by mathematics that space exploration could be carried on by midgets at a fraction of the cost and risk of the same job done by normal-sized men. He was, of course, quite right. The cabins and air and food supplies for a spaceship's crew of midgets would cost and weigh a fraction of similar equipment for 6-footers. But people simply weren't interested in sending midgets out into space. But Mike had gotten here. He was in the space platform. There were full-sized men who would joyfully have changed places with him, 41-inch height and all. So Mike was blissful. The tube ended, and Joe bounced off the wall that faced its end. Sanford was waiting. He grinned with more than a hint of spite. "Here's our communications room," he said. "Now you can talk down to Earth. It'll be relayed now, but in half an hour you can reach the shed direct." He floated inside. Joe followed cautiously. There was another crew member on duty there. He sat before a group of radar screens, with thigh grips across his legs to hold him in his chair. He turned his head and nodded cheerfully enough. "Here," snapped Sanford. Joe clambered awkwardly to the seat the senior crew member pointed out. He made his way to it by handholds on the walls. He fumbled into the chair and threw over the curved thigh grips that would hold him in place. Suddenly he was oriented. He had seen this room before the platform was launched. True, the man at the radar screens was upside down with reference to himself, and Sanford had hooked a knee negligently around the arm of a firmly anchored chair, with his body at right angles to Joe's own, but at least Joe knew where he was and what he was to do. "Go ahead and report," said Sanford sardonically. "You might tell them that you heroically destroyed the rockets that attacked us, and that your crew behaved splendidly, and that you have landed in the space platform and the situation is well in hand. It isn't, but it will make nice headlines." Joe said evenly, "Our arrival's been reported?" "No," said Sanford, grinning. "Obviously, the radar down on Earth, shipboard ones on this hemisphere, of course, have reported that the platform still exists. But we haven't communicated since the bombs went off. They probably think we had so many punctures that we lost all our air and are all wiped out. They'll be glad to hear from you that we aren't." Joe threw a switch, frowning. This wasn't right. Sanford was the senior scientist on board, and hence in command, because he was the best qualified to direct the scientific observations the platform was making. But there was something specifically wrong. The communicator hummed. A faint voice sounded. It swelled to loudness.
"Calling space platform. Calling space platform. Calling space platform."
Joe turned down the volume. He said into the microphone, "Space platform calling Earth. Joe Kenmore reporting. We have made contact with the platform and completed our landing. Our cargo is now being unloaded. Our landing rockets had to be expended against presumably hostile bombs, and we are now unable to return to Earth. The ship and the platform, however, are unharmed. I am now waiting for orders. Report ends." He turned away from the microphone. Sanford said sharply, "Go on, tell them what a hero you are." "I'm going to help unload my ship," Joe said shortly. "You report what you please." "Get back at that transmitter!" shouted Sanford furiously. "Tell him you're a hero! Tell him you're wonderful! I'll tell him how useless it is!" Joe saw the other man in the room, the man at the radar screen, shake his head. He got up and fumbled his way along the wall to the door. Sanford shouted after him angrily. Joe went out, found the 4-foot tunnel, and floated, not down but along it, back to the unloading dock. Wordlessly, he set to work to get the cargo out of the cargo hold of the spaceship. Handling objects in weightlessness, which on Earth would be heavy, was an art in itself. 2 men could move tons. It needed only 1 man to start a massive crate in motion. However, one had either to lift or push an object in the exact line it was to follow. To thrust hard for a short time produced exactly the same effect as to push gently for a longer period. Anything floated tranquilly in the line along which it was moved. The man who had to stop it, though, needed to use exactly as much energy as the man who sent it floating. He needed to check the floating thing in exactly the same line. If one tried to stop a massive shipment from one side, he would topple into it, and he and the crate together would go floundering helplessly over each other. The chief had gone off to help maneuver 2-ton guided missiles into launching tubes. One crew member remained with Haney, unloading things that would have to be handled with cranes on Earth. Joe found himself needed most in the storage chamber. A crate floated from the ship to the crewman. Standing head downward, he stopped its original movement, braced himself, and sent it floating to Joe. He braced himself, stopped its flight, and, very slowly, to move fast with anything heavy in his hands would pull his feet from the floor, set it on a stack of similar objects which would presently be fastened in place. Everything had to be done in slow motion, or one would lose his footing. Joe worked painstakingly. He gradually began to understand the process, but the muscles of his stomach ached because of their continuous, instinctive cramp due to the sensation of unending fall. Mike floated through the hatchway from the lock. He twisted about as he floated, and his magnetized soles clanked to a deft contact with the wall. He said calmly, "That guy Sanford is cracked up. He's potty. If this were jail, he'd be stir-crazy. He's yelling into the communicator now that we'll all be dead in a matter of days, and the rocket missiles we brought up won't help. He's nasty about it, too." Haney called from the cargo space of the ship in the lock. "All empty here. We're unloaded." There were sounds as he closed the cargo doors. Haney, followed by the chief, came into view, floating as Mike had done, but he didn't land as skillfully. He touched the wall on his hands and knees and bounced away, and tried helplessly to swim to a handhold. It would have been funny, except that Joe was in no mood for humor. Mike whipped off his belt and flipped the end of it to Haney. He caught it and was drawn gently to the wall. Haney's shoes clicked to a hold. The chief landed more expertly. "We need wings here," he said ruefully. "You reported, Joe?" Joe nodded. He turned to Brent, the crew member who'd been unloading. He knew him, too, from their 2-way video conversations. "Sanford does act oddly," he said uncomfortably. "When he met me in the lock, he said our coming was useless. He talked about the futility of everything while I reported. He sounds like he sneers at every possible action as useless." "Most likely it is," Brent said mildly. "Here, anyhow. It does look as if we're going to be knocked off, but Sanford's taking it badly. The rest of us have let him act as he pleased, because it didn't seem to matter.